Hello and welcome. I'm Shivai, the host of this YouTube channel where I talk to people from academia and beyond. For this episode of Why Shivai, I had the privilege to talk to Professor Todd McGowan. Todd McGowan is a professor of English and film studies at the University of Vermont, US. He has authored 15 books, including Embracing Alienation, Emancipation After Hegel, Cambridge Introduction to Jacques Lacan, and The Impossible David Lynch, among many others. In the limited time I had with Professor Todd, we talked about the problem of subjectivity and how Jacques Lacan, the famous psychoanalyst, tries to solve it. We then discussed the philosophers and their ideas, particularly Immanuel Kant, using which Lacan developed his three famous registers, namely the symbolic order, the imaginary, and the real. And also, if there are any parallels between Freud's structural model of the id, ego, and the superego, and Lacan's three registers. Moving ahead in the conversation, we talked about Kojève and Hegel's idea of lordship and bondage, which Alexander Kojève translates to the master-slave dialectics. Professor Todd McGowan is widely known for making obscure ideas more accessible with his writings and also his YouTube. And I wouldn't be wrong if I said he did exactly that in this following conversation. I hope listeners find value in this and it helps them simplify or understand Lacan better. The conversation with Professor Todd McGowan starts now. Enjoy. You're good to go, right? So, Professor, my first question is actually two statements from your book, The Cambridge Introduction to Jacques Lacan. If I'm not butchering his name, I'm not good with French, so please forgive me. Right. So, there are two statements. Subjectivity is our inescapable problem, number one, and Jacques Lacan is a philosopher of the subject. Now, three questions arise out of these two statements that you have written in your book. What is this problem of subjectivity that we're talking about, as basic as it can get? And why does it matter to us? And the third question, which is the most important to our conversation right here, is who is this man, a mysterious man named in the statement itself, Jacques Lacan, right? So, three questions in total. What is the problem of subjectivity? Why does it matter? And who is Jacques Lacan? Please, Professor.
Okay. All right. So historically, the problem of subjectivity was the problem of how we know things, right? Like just the question, how can we know anything? And this was most famously, I think, taken up by Immanuel Kant, or most successfully, I would say, and he tried to say that it's through, Kant was the first one to widely use the term subject, and he was in the sense that we understand it now. And his idea was when we know something, we know there's a difference between knowing things as they appear and knowing things in themselves, and we can only know appearances. And that was, for him, that was a really revolutionary moment. So subjectivity concerned with how we know. What psychoanalysis does is it comes along and says, well, okay, but how we know is really wrapped up in how we desire. So the question of subjectivity becomes a question of how we desire, and then knowing is in some sense secondary to how we desire, right? So if you desire in a certain way, then how you know is going to be influenced by the way that you desire. Just like the people, I think this is pretty easy to see, right? That if people have a certain political position, what they know is totally different than what people of the opposing political position have. Like just their basic facts are different. So the question of desire, what we desire, becomes preeminent and is tied to this question of subjectivity. So oftentimes you could say subject of desire instead of just subject. So it's how you desire, and desire isn't just what you want, Like, I wake up this morning, I'm hungry, I want a bagel or I want a piece of toast. No, it's our desire is unconscious. So it's often, or maybe always, not what we think that we consciously want. So that's a really important way to understand subjectivity. Now, who's Jacques Lacan? So Jacques Lacan is is born about 40 years after Freud, and he's in what's known as the second generation of psychoanalysts. And what's important or significant about him is he's the first. So Freud was very well educated and even dreamed of being a philosopher, but he didn't really have an education in philosophy. Like he knew Kant a little bit, but he didn't know Hegel, Schelling, these kind of figures, Spinoza so much. But for Lacan did. And so one of the things that Lacan does is bring philosophy into, this is the arguments that I make in the book that you made reference to, that he brings philosophy into psychoanalysis. So that's, to me, that's what really constitutes its importance. What the other thing that people often draw attention to is that Lacan was very influenced by linguistics and structuralism, and he brings that also into psychoanalysis. So he thinks about, say, let's take a standard psychoanalytic idea, repression. Like you can't think a certain idea because it's repressed. Well, what Lacan does is he links that to what he calls the signifier. So it's not just an idea that's repressed for Lacan, it's a signifier that's repressed. And so, for instance, when you can't think of a certain word, a certain signifier, then Lacan would analyze, why is it that signifier and not another that trips you up? So that's one of the ways that structural linguistics dimension of his thought works. But I would say it's mostly the real impact that philosophy had on Lacan and that he brings to psychoanalysis that constitutes his importance.
You mentioned Kant, you mentioned philosophy, of course, you mentioned structuralism, and you also mentioned signifier. Let's go with them one by one, right? Through them one by one. So we talked about subjectivity, and of course, I'm a student of philosophy, right? So subjectivity, as you also mentioned, is a nodal point, or was a nodal point for modern Western philosophy, which was beginning with Descartes, right? Where for him, one cannot doubt the doubting subject, and therefore eventually doubting asserts one's identity, if I'm getting it right. And it becomes important for Lacan, as you mentioned, because Lacan passes through Descartes. Well, even Freud passes through Descartes and uses his doubt into understanding unconscious. And I would like you to talk about it a bit more. And then Lacan through Descartes reaches Kant and Hegel, right? Who are trying to understand the connection between the subject and the object by bridging the gap between the two. If I'm getting it right, Professor. Is it it's very evident that how different philosophers have employed different methods to understand subjectivity. Makes sense. Well, that is a domain of philosophy in that limited knowledge I perceive. But how come a psychoanalyst who is highly influenced by Freud tries to understand it? Why it becomes important for him, as you mentioned, the concept of desire comes in, right? And I want to understand through what frame of reference. Does he already have a system to understand subjectivity that he is borrowing from Freud? Or is Lacan in the process of developing it? Does my question make sense, Professor?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, I think he would say, whether it's true or not, I think is maybe questionable, but I think Lacan would say he's just developing the system of subjectivity that's implicit in Freud's own work and that he's just bringing out, right? But I think a lot of people would say, in fact, this guy, American guy, Bruce Fink, wrote a book called The Lacanian Subject, in which he definitely identifies Lacan with the understanding of a certain kind of subjectivity. So I don't know. I mean, it's a hard question to answer because so the way Lacan talks a lot is I'm just finding something that's already there in Freud. But if you go there back to Freud, he doesn't exactly say it. But the thing that he does, and this is I think the essence of your question, what does he do that's different than these other philosophers, right? Well, like I said, he turns to the problem of unconscious desire. And so that means, and I think you're right to link it to Descartes in a pretty fundamental way, because the fact that you're a subject of unconscious desire means there's something within you that you can't know. And that barrier to your knowledge is actually what constitutes your subjectivity. And similarly, for Descartes, it's precisely the fact that you can doubt everything that is the source of subjectivity, right? So there's a real similarity. The difference is that Freud thinks, and Lacan thinks this too, that you can only discover what you don't know about yourself through interactions with the other, right? And that's what psychoanalysis is trying to do. Whereas Descartes famously locked himself in a cabin and reflected on him and tried to doubt by himself to come to his Cartesian version of subjectivity, even though he doesn't use the word, but that's what he's discovering. So it's different in that way. And I think that just, to me, is evidence for this shift from knowledge to desire, because desire is always about the interaction, right? Like you're all, and this is very famously, Lacan said, our desire is the desire of the other, right? So we're always gauging our desire through what we think someone else wants. Like we even the term of address we use to talk to them, right? Like, do they want to be known by their title or do they want to be known by their first name? Like we're trying to gauge that when we talk to them, or do they want to be, or do they consider themselves male or female? So we try to gauge that when we talk to them, and we don't want to, I mean, we might want to perversely do the opposite of what they desire, but most of the time we're trying to say, oh, what do they want me to say in this situation? Like when you go to order something at a restaurant, right? Like we're thinking like, how does the waiter want, I mean, we want to get what we want to eat, obviously, but you think to yourself, how does the waiter want me to respond here? Should I call the waiter over? Should I wait till they come? You're always thinking about their desire. And even sometimes if you go to a kind of food you've never had before, you might even say to the waiter, what's good here? Or say, what's good here? Like, and what you're saying is, what should I desire? Right. And so that to me, that's one of the greatest examples of what Lacan says is our desire is the desire of the other. So that's different than knowledge and different than Descartes, because it's involved with other people implicitly, and he can't get away from other people. But yeah, I would say, yeah, he's developing his own theory, but it's really Freud that makes this great breakthrough about desire.
So, as you mentioned, can we set a bit of a context for how Lacan is developing his theory based on Freud, right? And it starts with this, right? Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, writes, all our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to understanding, and ends with reason, right? So he has this theory of knowledge and he integrates these three things to explain how human beings understand the world. And you draw a parallel in the book saying that Lacan was influenced by this, primarily this, developing his three registers, the symbolic order, the imaginary, and the real. I want to understand how. And well, I don't really want to get into the concepts of the symbolic order, the imaginary, and the real right now, but I want to understand how do you draw the parallel and how does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so this is some of the things I say in the book are commonplaces, like everybody sort of thinks that about Lacan. This is not one. This is something that I don't think other people have said. And here's what I would say. So I think one way you can think about Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and real is that the symbolic is the point from which it anchors us. It's a point from which we perceive and see. The imaginary is the field that we see. And then the real is this thing that disrupts both of those areas. Like it disrupts both where we see from, it disrupts the field that we see. Okay. So how does that link to Kant? Well, so Kant, the sensibility, as you mentioned, is how we take in the world, right? Through our senses. The understanding is how we order the world. That's what gives the categories that create significance in the world. And then reason, it's interesting because for Kant, reason always gets into trouble because it tries to do too much and reveals certain what he calls antinomies or certain errors of logic, right? And so in Lacan's case, I think you can see a kind of direct parallel, right? Like the imaginary is it's what we take in our senses. I think that parallel is exact. And then the symbolic is how we structure things. So it's from where we see how we structure what we see. Do we put it in a certain category? Kant's famous example is causality. Like, do we see things in terms of causes? And that would be for Lacan just part of the symbolic order. That's the way the symbolic order functions. And then the more controversial one, I would say, probably is this notion of linking reason to the real. But I think the key is that the real is the point at which things slip up or go awry or become contradictory. Like Lacan repeatedly says, the real is the impossible. But he also thinks the impossible happens. So it's not impossible in the sense that we usually understand it. And so that contradiction is, to me, exactly aligned with what Kant calls reason. So I think that's I just think that's to think of Lacan first and foremost as a Kantian thinker is a really important gesture. And I think it's in those three registers that it maybe becomes queerist.
Could you please take me through, and maybe the audience who will be watching it right in the future, through these three registers one by one and in detail, right? You have to just touch them and move beyond past them, but to understand what does a symbolic order means, what does the imaginary means, and what does the real mean, please.
So I think Lacan is most famous for I think this is right, most famous for his understanding of the symbolic order. And I mentioned before the influence of linguistics. So the symbolic order is a signifying structure that gives us the basis or the foundation for how we understand the world. So if you have, like, our signifiers come from the symbolic order. So if you can have a signifier for a certain thing, and then you're able to perceive that thing because you have the signifier for it. So that just, I think, shows the power of the symbolic order. Like if you don't even have the signifier, the thing that you encounter doesn't make any sense. So the signifier and the symbolic order is the realm of sense. It's what gives us a sense of things, right? It allows us to understand things. Again, this link to the Kantian understanding. And then the imaginary is really, so image, of course, suggests visuality. And so it is definitely everything that we can see. That's for him, imaginary. But he also thinks, and perceive in general, perception in general, not just sight. But he definitely thinks that the imaginary has an effect and that is negative, that is a problem in a way that the symbolic order is not a problem for him. It's totally necessary, etc. But the imaginary is a problem. Why? Because when we think of things in imaginary terms, we think of them as whole. Like they're so when you're thinking imagistically or in terms of the imaginary, you're seeing a whole where something really is fragmented. And the most well-known example of this is Kant describes what he calls the mirror stage, where, as Kant, that's a funny slip. Lacan describes what he calls the mirror stage, where an infant looks in the mirror, has a fragmented body, doesn't have total control of the body, looks in the mirror and says, oh, I'm just this one thing, and thus what Lacan calls the ego forms through this misperception, imaginary misperception of fragmentation as a whole. So that's the deleterious effect of the imaginary, whereas you don't have a negative necessary side of the symbolic. It's just symbolic is necessary. And then the real is, for Lacan, like I said, it's what disrupts, or I think this idea that the real is the impossible is an important way to think of it. And so at any point in any symbolic order, certain things are impossible to happen, right? Like right now, it's impossible that there would be a worldwide communist revolution, right? Like it just doesn't, it's just within our current symbolic matrix, that's just impossible. Similarly, when I was a kid, it was impossible that the communist world would collapse. Just as impossible. No one thought of it. We didn't even dream of it happening. Even the American CIA, 6 months before it happened, had no idea it was going to happen, right? And then it happened. So that to me is maybe the greatest example of the real, because it's something that's within our symbolic coordinates, our symbolic world is impossible, and yet it happens. So that's, to me, what he's saying with the idea of the real is there are certain things that are ruled out symbolically, but nonetheless can happen. And so and this is why I think a lot of political thinkers are drawn to Lacan, because he opens up this possibility of a really radical act that changes everything, right? And that's maybe the radical edge of his thinking, that he was himself not political, but that political thinkers are drawn to in him.
You mentioned about the middle stage, which is interesting, of course. What is the time when Lacan develops the middle stage? Because it is of interest to me. When I was reading your text, it said that the middle stage produces an idea of the wholeness, of unity for the child that doesn't really exist in the first place. What is this idea of wholeness that you were talking about, or Lacan talks about? And you also mentioned that this deception is of high importance to understand something. I cannot recall what exactly, but you say that this deception is important to us. Why exactly?
Right, because it's the way Lacan thinks, it's the way that our ego forms. So in his theory, the ego is imaginary. So one of the things that he would say he's following Freud, but Freud is less critical of the ego than Lacan is. And Lacan is very, very, very critical of the ego, and a whole line of psychoanalytic thought that took the ego as its basis, known as ego psychology, basically American psychoanalysis. And the idea, so that's the wholeness that comes out of the mirror stage, is your own ego. So in one sense, it's necessary, right? You have to, obviously, you can't not have an ego. Everyone has to develop an ego, but to think that the ego is actually developing the ego is the aim of psychoanalysis, Lacan thinks that's crazy. Like, he thinks, no, the ego, precisely because it's imaginary. Like, you can't invest yourself in the ego, because that's going to lead you to all kinds of mistakes about the way that the world operates, and you're going to miss out. It causes you to miss the real, and so, which is for him the most important thing. So yeah, I mean, it is significant that you have to have this mirror stage and develop the ego, but you can't think that the ego is some kind of end point in itself, or developing a strong ego is something that psychoanalysis should be doing.
And what is the idea of the wholeness that one perceives that isn't really there?
So in his ideas, as an infant, your body, it's out of your control, right? Like, your arms do things, your legs do things, you don't control them. But you look in the mirror and you think, oh, I see that body, it's just whole, that's me. That's what you say, that's me. I'm this whole thing. And anytime this happens, and he was very clear that the mirror stage is it's not like a stage you have and you're done with it. You think anytime you really look in the mirror, you grasp your sense of, oh, that's me. I'm this whole thing, when in fact, you're not. You're not just fragmented, you're divided, right? You're divided by what? By your desire. And so that's what you don't see in the mirror and what the ego as a whole hides. Wholeness always hides for Lacan. That's a really crucial idea.
And, and Professor, this might be very naive, but if you could please explain this to me, how are we exactly divided by our desires?
Because we don't want our own desires, right? We consciously do not want what we unconsciously desire. So we unconsciously desire things that subvert our own good, that are not good for us, right? We consciously wish for things. You can think of it like this, like there's conscious wishes on the one hand, or wants, and then there's unconscious desires on the other hand. And those are at odds with each other, right? They cannot be reconciled because your unconscious is always subverting what's good for you. And consciously, you're always trying to find what's good for you. Even if it's unhealthy, you still want it to be pleasurable. Whereas unconscious is even subverting your pleasure. So that's the divide between those two things, between unconscious desire and conscious wishes.
If I have to put this rhetorically, can I also say, right? Because I think I read this somewhere in Bruce Fink, the clinical introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? And he talks about desire operates the dialectics of desire. And he rightly says, once you get what you want, you don't want it anymore, right? And the satisfaction that satisfaction that was anticipated does not reach to you. And therefore, one could say, even if rhetorically, that desire desires its own deferral, right? There's a postponement of satisfaction that reaches that point, right? Could it be said this? Right. Okay. Okay. So I was watching one of your interviews with conversations, I would say, with Rahul, right? On his YouTube. And Rahul rightly says, though I don't know him yet, right? But he rightly says, when one has Todd McGowan on their podcast, you cannot not ask about Hegel, right? And it would feel like a sin, right? So I completely agree with him. And here's my question. And it is concerned with Lacan, because you mention in the book, in the chapter where it's about the life of Lacan, that he, for the very first time, comes across, and please correct me if I'm wrong, he comes across Hegel when he attends Kojève's lectures, right? Which is now transcribed into a book, An Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. And the very first chapter, the introduction of the book, which is upon the master-slave dialectics, is something that really interests Lacan, right? I want to understand how.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think Kojève is the most important thinker for Lacan. Almost more than Freud. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. And yes, and he rightly calls him the master, truly the one, right, of his life, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to understand, how did the master-slave dialectic shaped very significantly how Lacan then thought? Because philosophically, there is a limit to what we can understand according to Kant, right? But Hegel has something to say about it, because the moment there is a contradiction and the contradiction conceals something, it also reveals something at the same time. This is the famous idea that Hegel gives, and he tries to understand something through the contradiction itself. I want to know, how does Lacan integrates the idea of dialectic into his approach of understanding, or maybe theorizing subjectivity further into his career, if it's making sense as a question.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, I think you gave a great description of Hegel's movement past Kant, that Kant thinks once you encounter a contradiction, that's the end of thinking. And Hegel thinks, no, the contradiction actually reveals something positive. And so it's interesting. So early on in Lacan's thinking, the real for him just means like the rock of reality, just like real things, right? Well, how we all define real. But then after a certain point, the real starts to become what we talked about earlier, the impossible, the point of failure within the symbolic structure. And that's where I think the influence of Hegel lies, right? So why would what's impossible ever become possible? Well, it's kind of exactly what Hegel's talking about in his critique of Kant, right? If we run into a contradiction and there's a positive uh, outcome of the contradiction, like it reveals something to us that otherwise would have remained hidden, then then
Professor, could you, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but please give an example about the thing that you mentioned about Hegel, reaching a contradiction and revealing something at the same time when it's concealing something.
okay, so you brought up the master and servant dialectic, right? Which is Kojève's, that's his favorite part of Hegel. It's basically the only thing he talks about, and over influenced. It makes that everyone talks about that way too much, in my view. But let's just take Everson. Everyone knows that. That's the one thing people know about Hegel. Let's just talk about that. So that the point is the master runs into a problem, right? Because the master wants recognition from the servant, but it wants recognition from a servant that's worthy of giving recognition to the master. But if the servant has agreed to become a servant, the servant isn't even worthy of giving the recognition. And thus, this is a contradiction in mastery. And so that leads, so then, okay, so that's a contradiction that leads, and then what does it lead to? Well, it leads Hegel to say, well, maybe in the servant, there's a real possibility of discovering some kind of subjectivity that was closed off to the master because the master ran into this contradiction. And then I think this is true. The whole rest of the phenomenology is really what happens to the servant after the servant runs into its own series of problems. So that's a case where you run into a contradiction, and then all of a sudden, like everyone thinks, oh my God, who would want to be a servant? You'd want to be a master. But Hegel shows, no, mastery is a dead end. It's servitude that really has more insight to it, right? And so that would be one example. And so that would be like the real of the master. You could put it in Lacan's terms, right? Like the real of the master ends up showing this insight that's in the servant has that the master doesn't have, right? And the insight concerns the relationship to death, I think. So that would be one example. But there, like you could take like every single movement in Hegel's thought and say, okay, there's a symbolic deadlock that occurs, and then what's the point of the real that exists? And then that ends up starting whatever the next thing is, right? So I think you could, I mean, I don't do this even in my book on Hegel, but you can read Hegel at every point as like in Lacan's terms, right? So the overlap between the two of them is really incredible, I think. At times, again, I mean, I think, like I said, early on, Lacan is using the real not in just the very ordinary sense, and so he's not really Hegelian at all. But then there's this period where he becomes very much so, and I think Hegel there really is that notion of the real is evident in Hegel's thought through the very movements that take place.
I know I'm digressing, but now that you have mentioned Hegel, I have just a few questions from the thing that you mentioned, right? You talked about the master-slave dialectics, right? Would it be right to say, because Kojève puts it that way, that the master, once he stops, I'm assuming that the master is he, right? So people should not call me out for this, right? Once the master stops engaging with the labor, because Hegel calls labor as the essence of man, right? The master reaches a point of existential impasse, right? So could one say this might be the case where he reaches a crisis that is existential in nature, right? And the second thing that you said, well, people would come up to you, or maybe in general say to Hegel, right, or have an opinion about him, that why would anybody want to be a slave, right? Why servitude? Why not mastery, right? And then you would say, well, Hegel would say that reaching the stage of absolute consciousness is only the capacity the slave could attain, not the master itself, right? And if I'm framing that right. But can you not think, right, even in modern terms, the masters who are the masters, right, they could use this very thing against servitude or slaves, that they would say, well, you are the one, right, who would be reaching that stage of absolute consciousness, so you must pay for it, right? Am I asking a bad question? Is not making sense?
It's not right. The whole point is that servitude isn't a stopping point, right? Because it has its own problems. So it's not like Hegel's justifying servitude as the end position, because he goes like the position that servitude ends up turning into is Stoicism, and there's no philosophy that Hegel hates more than Stoicism. So it's not like servitude is the end point. It's just more that mastery is, as you said, an existential. This is Kojev's line. It's an existential impasse. And so it's more that it's a critique of masters, less an ideological justification for servitude. It's not that at all, because servitude isn't the end point of the phenomenology. And I think that really, I think that is a kind of a problem. I was once giving a talk to a group of young, I don't know, like a political group. And I was saying what Hegel's position on servitude was, and they got very angry with me. They're just for kind of the reason you said, and they like shut off the the Zoom connection. So it was not a great moment, but I wasn't trying to say, oh, he's providing this ideological justification for servitude. No, it's not the end point. It's more he's providing a critique of mastery. And I think if we look at all the masters in the world, look at how vacant their position is, right? And so I think that seems not very I think that's pretty correct. It's not very far-fetched.
Right. Yeah, I had that question because I saw somebody on YouTube asking that question, so I thought maybe I'll ask a scholar. So, well, yes, that justifies my basic curiosity. Coming back to Hegel and Lacan, and you mentioned how there could be an understanding of Hegel even in Lacan's work. And I think somebody who does a very beautiful job of marrying Hegel, Lacan, and also Marx is one of your dear friends, Professor Zizek, right? And well, we'll talk about it in the end later, because I think it all constitutes, right, the things that we're talking about. But coming back to the same thing about the three registers that you mentioned, that Lacan mentioned, the symbolic order, the imaginary, and the real, the way you gave the description, and please forgive me because this is a very stupid question in itself, but I have to ask you to just get rid of it. To if there's any possibility of this question being valid or invalid, I just want to know, right? So the question is, Lacan's are Lacan's registers, these three registers, by any chance identical to Freud's structural model of the id, ego, and the superego? Because uh, you see that there is a similarity in a way. When Lacan talks about the symbolic order and Freud talks about the superego, there could be a thing that has a similarity, right? Or if Lacan talks about the imaginary and Freud talks about the ego, there's again a connection, and the id in the real as well.
It's a great question, actually. It's not a bad question. There's certainly the parallel between the ego and the imaginary. Absolutely there. That's absolutely true. The problem I'm having is coming up with one that connects to the symbolic, because I don't think you can call the superego symbolic. Like, I think there's the force, like Lacan very famously says, there is one thing that commands us to enjoy, and it is the superego. So the superego, it seems to me, is much more this force of the real. And then the id, you can't think of the id as symbolic. It has to be the real too. So it's like there's too much associated with the real. And ironically, because you'd think more would be associated with the symbolic, but that's my problem with the parallel. I see the ego imaginary connection it's self-evident. That's exactly right. I just don't see something attached to the symbolic. Like, I don't think that Freud, all those registers have something to do with the symbolic, of course, but their main force, like the main force of the id is the real. The main force of the superego is the real, right? Like, so that's the only thing that's what gives me pause in making that exact comparison. Now, what's interesting is I think early on in Lacan's early thought, I think he would have said not that the superego is the symbolic, but the id is the symbolic, because he associates the symbolic in his early seminars with desire. And so, because the real, as I said, is just like reality. So then I think then the parallel would work pretty well. But I don't even know, even then the real that would not really fit with superego. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think it quite works, but I do understand the impulse to make that link. And I do think it's right to see imaginary. I mean, Lacan even says this directly. Ego is imaginary.
Okay, makes sense, and clears a lot of things from me as well. You rightly mentioned a few moments ago that psychoanalysis, and I'm paraphrasing, is more or less the study of the I in relation to the other, right? It's more of a mediation that goes on. And this is also the case with maybe German idealism for that matter, right? That I am the other, and there is no I without the mediation of the other, and so on and so forth. The question that I'm going to ask concerns the other, and this other includes the contemporaries that were working with Lacan, right? And it concerns his personal life as well. Two questions. Number one, why do you not call Lacan a social constructionist, if that's the term, right? And number two, why is it that Lacan uses and references to a number of his contemporaries in his works or even in his seminars, right? But his contemporaries are not mentioning Lacan at all, except I believe Althusser was the one who rightly used Lacan. And other than that, not many people used any of his concepts of the mirror stage or even of the Borromean rings or the object petit, right? If I'm not butchering the pronunciation right now. Right. And or maybe sexuation, right? Or any of the ideas that Lacan gave, they were not used by the
Right. Yeah. It's a strange situation. So yeah, I don't really have a theory about that. I mean, part of it is, I think there are two things actually. So one is that his most important ideas were given orally in his seminars, they were not written down, and the writings are very, very abstruse and hard to get through, not hard to get to, hard to get through. So I think a lot of people didn't even really know what his thinking was. So, like, let's take the most famous people, right? Like Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. Interestingly, Simone de Beauvoir, as she was writing The Second Sex, contacted Lacan and said, because his writings were not helpful to her, she contacted him and said, could we meet 4 times? I think I recount this in the book. I'd like to get a sense of what psychoanalysis is for my book on feminism. and he said, no, actually, we'd have to meet 6 months every week. And so, and she goes, yeah, I don't have time for that. And then so it never happened. So there are certain people that tried to make it happen. I mean, the other thing is Lacan was a little quarrelsome. So he was a little bit, he didn't just play nice with others. So I think that may have been part of it too. But yeah, I think the difficulty of his two things. So the difficulty of the written work that people could access, and then the almost impossibility of getting, you have to go to all of his seminars, which people weren't. I mean, certain philosophers did it, like Jean Hippolyte, the Hegelian philosopher, went to his seminar for a couple of years. Paul Ricoeur went to his seminar. But Paul Ricoeur went, this very famous not famous, but interesting anecdote recounted by the Lacan's biographer, Elizabeth Ionescu. And Ricoeur had been going for 2 years. This well-known hermeneutical philosopher from France. And Lacan calls him up after the seminar one day and says, oh, how do you think that went today? And Ricoeur goes, I got to be honest, I haven't understood anything since I've been coming. And Lacan just hung up the phone on him. And they never spoke after that. So he was so pissed. So I think that's kind of it. Like, it's just, I think the difficulty of access, and then I think that really explains why he wasn't. Whereas Althusser and he were friends, so I think they talked privately, like in the way Beauvoir wanted to talk with him, right? So, to be honest, Althusser's reading of Lacan is terrible. So I'm not sure that he really got that much valuable from him. What was the first question? Sorry, I got lost in the second.
Social constructionism.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely opposed. Right. So why is that? So a lot of people in America, at least, did associate Lacan with social constructionism because of this emphasis on the symbolic. So if you think everything is just symbolic, then you think it's a product of symbolic construction rather than biological forces, right? Okay, that would be fine, but Lacan thinks of this other category, the real, which is what disrupts all symbolic. So for him, yeah, there are symbolic constructions of things, social constructions of things, but they all fail and end up collapsing. So he ends up undermining. So his point would be social construction always, you can never bank on it because it's always the identities that are constructed they always implode. They always fail. They always contradict themselves. That's the idea of the real. That's the idea of desire. I mean, desire, once you think in terms of unconscious desire, you can't be a social constructionist because you think you're going to desire against how you're constructed, right? Like that's the whole point of psychoanalysis. That's why there's this unreconcilable opposition in the world between social constructionists, who are the majority, and people that believe in psychoanalysis. Because if you believe in psychoanalysis and you believe someone has an unconscious, then you cannot accept that they just are their social construction in a way like someone like Michel Foucault would want to argue, right? Because why not? Because their desire is working against what they're like. I was constructed to be like fundamentalist Christian, conservative. But I just my desire went totally against that, right? So it didn't work. Like the construction, then that's the whole point of psychoanalysis. Constructions don't work. They fail all the time. They don't work.
Right. And a question that might seem very similar to this, but isn't really similar, is Lacan was expelled from his practice as a psychoanalyst because he reduced the timing of his sessions, right? And one very interesting thing that comes out of his idea for doing it was he was really interested in what the patient has, or I would say analysand, not the patient, right? What the analysand has to say and not what the analysand means. So this was something of interest to him as well, right? And also Freud. My question is, why is the psychoanalyst, and it might go back to the unconscious, the desire, the slip, right? All of the things that Freud said. But still, why is a psychoanalyst interested in what one says and not what one means?
Right. You just said it, because of the unconscious versus consciousness. Like what you mean is what you consciously intend. What you say is that's how your unconscious expresses itself. So if I mean, like, let's just take the most cliched example. Like if I mean to call my spouse by her name, but I instead call her by my mother's name, then my meaning, okay, whatever. Of course, I meant the thing consciously, but I unconsciously expressed this. I'm sorry for picking the most cliched psychoanalytic example. I unconsciously expressed this desire for my mother, right? So that's why there's attention to what's said and not what's meant, because what you mean you can control consciously, right? But what you say, everyone knows this, right? What you say goes out of your unconscious control all the time. Like earlier, I had a slip where I called Lacan Kant, right? And so I didn't mean to do that, but it just happened, right? So what I said, and even if you think about the way that you speak, your intentions, how you're speaking is always out ahead of your intention, right? Like I have certain intentions, or I'm talking to you right now, but as I'm speaking, I have to speak fast, of course, because we're having a conversation. And what I'm saying is out ahead of what I'm intending. And so I often, not even when I slip, but everything I say is going to be more revelatory than what I mean to try to say. I mean, that can include your gestures, it can include anything.
But Professor, I read something very similar along the lines that psychoanalysts have to say about language, that language can never truly express how you feel. Well, it can be a question that language might be a mystery and there might not be accurate words or accurate feelings. But 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 the book I read, the book by Bruce Fink, he mentions that language only serves as a tool for misunderstanding rather than understanding. Why is that?
For the reason I just said, right? Because what you cannot say in language is what you desire, right? So whatever you say is going to, in some way, hide the desire that's being said, or that's the desire that's being articulated beneath what you say, right? So if someone says, like, I really want you to love me, right? Like, well, what does that mean? Like, you have to, when someone says that, you're not sure okay, how do they want me to manifest that? Do they even really want that? Or maybe what they really want is me to stand up to them and not just, so the point is that no matter what you say, it can never be said directly, because there's always this unconscious desire accompanying everything that's said, which is why, as Bruce said, language is this realm of misunderstanding rather than understanding.
Right, rather a simpler answer. I was expecting something more to it, but it has a simple answer, right? I hope you're not disappointed by my simple questions at all, because I'm really like makes sense, makes sense. I just have one more question from this section, right? A slip again. I said session instead of section, right? I do not know why, because we have a time limit and we are very close to it, right? So I just have one more question from this section and then we'll quickly sum it up, because I understand how busy you are, right? One last thing that concerns Lacanian psychoanalysis, and that is, what is objet petit a, right? So what does it mean, Professor?
Okay, right. So objet petit a, and it's also known as object small a, objet a, object a. All these mean the same thing. They're not different things. Okay, Lacan just switches what he means by them. So it develops around 1960 in his thinking, so pretty late in his thought. And the idea is, it's the object that causes us to desire, not the object of desire. And so it's more, if you think about it, the objet a is more what blocks our access to something and then invites us to want it, rather than what is the thing itself. So my favorite example of this is a can of soda, right? Like the can, like if you could just open your mouth, there's unlimited supply of Coca-Cola coming down in, it wouldn't be desirable, right? You'd be like, okay, I don't want to have, that's too much Coke. I don't want it. But the can, it's a barrier to how much you can have. It's 12 here. It's 12 ounces. It's kind of small. I don't know how much it is in India. It's small. It's not a huge thing, right? A huge thing isn't even as desirable. Like a big jug of Coke, it's not as desirable as a little can, because a little can, it confines the amount. And then it's precisely that barrier, that limit, that makes the thing inside desirable. So that's my favorite example of it. But I mean, you can think of many others, I'm sure. But it's the barrier. It's the barrier that causes the other thing. Let me give you one other example. So if you see someone where they're like, okay, that person would be perfect looking if they just didn't have that one little, I don't know, mark on their cheek, or the one little, you know, like, like if they just weren't bald, they'd look perfect. If one little thing, they just didn't have glasses, they'd be perfect looking. Okay. So that one little thing that's the objet art. Like that little mark, the bald, the glasses, that's objet art, right? Like because it's it's that little thing that detracts, that limits the object from being perfect, that makes it desirable. Because the thing that would be absolutely perfect is not desirable. So objet art is Lacan's way of distinguishing the object that causes our desire from the object of desire, right? So that's the idea.
Please tell me if I understood it right? And what I got from this is you're trying to say, in a way, the soda can example, right? The confinement in the very first place with the can that I have represents a kind of lack, and therefore I desire it more if it is limited in this water bottle, right? But if there is unlimited amount of can, there is a lack of the lack, and therefore I do not desire it at all, right?
Right.
Perfect, right. Okay. I recently read one of your quotes on Goodreads, and it was something about love, right? And that how when you love somebody, the most appalling qualities of somebody becomes the most desirable to you, right? And it was outstanding to me. Well, we'll keep that for the last bit, and because I'm very keen on the time limit, right? You have mentioned the turning point of your life was reading the Sublime Object of Ideology, this book right here, right? And you have quoted the story that you were on a flight, you got out, you called your friend, and you asked him to drop everything and read the book. I want you to first, of course, recount the story for people who are new to this parable, this narrative, right? And then I have a question. The question is, as I said earlier, Professor Zizek tries to successfully marries Hegel, Marx, and Lacan, right? I cannot help but recollect that Kojève did something very similar by marrying Heidegger, Hegel, and Marx, right? Of course, yes. So Professor Hegel Zizek does the same. He marries Hegel, Marx, and this time Lacan, and he tries to interpret or maybe reinterpret ideology, right? Because I do not know, but when I saw his documentary, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, it also had moments and scenes which might make me think about the same things he had written in the book itself, right? So I'm aware this might be a very bad reading of the text or of the documentary, but I want to ask you, Professor, what is the book about? And what does it try to achieve? And most importantly, why is it still very important, right? If it is at all. Yes.
So you recounted the story pretty well. I was in graduate school. I was part of a reading group. We were reading that book in January, and I thought I'll get a head start on it. I was on a flight to see my girlfriend who became my spouse in Boston. I was flying from Ohio, 2-hour flight or something. I started the book and I was just blown away. And when I landed, as I said, I called my close friend Paul Eisenstein, and I said, just don't, whatever you're doing, drop it, start reading this. We found what we were looking for. And we both thought that, and we still think that. And I think it's mainly for the thing that you said, that it's mainly because we had no idea that Lacan and we were both very invested in German idealism, right? Very invested. We had no idea that you could think about Lacan in those terms. That was just completely new to us. And then we were also very invested in Marx, and so connecting him also, that was totally new. So I would say the main influence of it and its lasting importance is for making that connection. I mean, Slavoj was really, his reading of Hegel, there's some precursors in people like Julian Rose, but he was really the first to make this Lacan German idealism connection. He's just the first. So that's amazing. And then I would say, what's the lasting importance of that book other than that? I think it's the theory of ideology that he develops there. And he says there's this great line early on in the book where he says, ideology doesn't deliver us from a traumatic social reality. It delivers us the social reality as the relief from a traumatic real. And so you can see the Lacanian influence on that line. But that theory of ideology, I think, is unsurpassed, and really, and that seems to me to constitute the real worth of that book, lasting worth of that book.
Right, right. Uh, uh, makes certain sense. Well, I'm about to end this conversation now, right? But before going, just simple questions, right? My is your book Embracing Alienation, because I just mentioned I'm reading it. I'm on the first chapter, which is what is it to be left undone, right? That is the name of the chapter, right? If I recall correctly. My question is somewhat similar, and the aim is to leave me, right, to think about things, right, about the book itself. The question is the subtitle of the book, and I want you to take your time and talk about this as much as you like, as much time as you have. Why should we try not to find ourselves, Professor? Why is that really a thing?
Okay. First of all, I had a totally different subtitle, and the press changed it to that, so it's not really my subtitle. But I don't mind it. I think I think it is in keeping with the idea of the book, because the whole point of the book is how, and it's kind of in keeping with what we've been saying about the unconscious and unconscious desire, right? Like the way that we feel alienated or out of touch with ourselves, or at a distance from ourselves, is that's who we authentically are. And when we try to become whole, or to find out who we really are, that's when I think we fall into certain ideological traps. So that's the basic claim of the book, that alienation, we always think alienation is terrible. We should maybe think it the other way. Like that's emancipatory. So
I saw one of the interviews of Professor Zizek, and he says, well, and I cannot help but recall this very famous scene from a very famous American series, Friends, right? Where this character says to the other character, well, be yourself, right? And the character just says, well, not too much. And this is what I recall. This is ridiculous to say in one of the interviews where he says, well, you should not be yourself because you are really a monster, right? And I do not know how that makes sense, but I get an idea that he's referring to the unconscious in some manner, right? Yes. Right. So, Professor, before going, if you could just tell me, right, what is it about David Lynch that appeals to you? Because I like watching cinema, and why is it that you only wrote a book about David Lynch? Because you are a French scholar as well, but why only David Lynch?
yeah, I always loved Lynch. I mean, I think that he's probably the filmmaker the most in touch with the unconscious. I mean, I think that's probably the easiest, the most correct answer. And I think what I noticed in him was a way of accessing our desire, our unconscious desire, that was different from any other filmmaker, right? And ways that are oftentimes incredibly disturbing, but appealing at the same time. So it comes back to this embracing alienation idea, right? Like it takes the thing that's really disturbing and makes it appealing, and Lynch does that in a great way.
Right. Okay. I mean, you really have your way through words, because you give me succinct and precise answers, and they totally make sense. Well, Professor, this would be it, but I really want you to be honest, right? And tell me, did you really find a merit in the questions I had to ask, and did you enjoy the conversation? Right. Oh, okay. So, Professor, first of all, thank you for doing this, because you just very kindly accepted my mail and appeared on the platform. And if you ever have the time in the future, just like this 1 hour again, anytime you're free, I would like to record more such sessions with you on your books like Emancipation of the Hegel, Embracing Alienation, or maybe David Lynch, only if you have the time and if you're not bored with my basic question.
Pour it on.
Right. Professor Todd, it was great to host you, and it is, I don't know if I should say it, but maybe I will. It's like a milestone for my YouTube channel to have somebody of your caliber and stature, right, to speak with me.
You will know that I would say that.
Right. So, yes, thanks a lot, Professor McGowan. And yeah, I feel great. Thanks for doing this, right?